All right, welcome everyone to a live edition of the Aftershock midweek, no game, but big news today as Jesse Fioranelli, General Manager of the Earthquakes, was let go. That's why all of you are here. That's why we are here. Let's get right to it. We don't want to keep people a long time. We've got some questions that have been put in our patron Slack channel. We're going to prioritize those and get to those in any remaining time. We'll try to take any out of our chat here on YouTube as well. Let's introduce the crew for anyone who doesn't know them. Alex Morgan, formerly of Quakes Talk, joined Quakes Epicenter this year, usually has been with me at the stadium. Colin Etnire, the original host of the Aftershock. And so he's graciously given us his name and his time this evening from the East Coast. Thank you for that, Colin. And for the first time on the Aftershock, Asher Kohn. Asher has been a writer for Quakes Epicenter for several years, kind of been my editor as well to actually help me write English way better than I typically do. And we're happy to have him on the show for the first time. Hey guys, welcome. Good evening to you. Asher, why don't we start with you? Coming into this, your reaction today when you saw the news of Jesse Fioranelli being let go by the club. Positive, negative, somewhere in the middle. Where did you come out?
I would have to say both, as unsatisfying as that is. It's hard to look at this roster and compare it to the roster from a few years ago and see it. It looks a lot of the same. A lot of the same issues in terms of roster construction are still there. That's on the general manager. At the same time, there was a lot of talk about this multi-year project that's been going on and this strong buy-in and belief in that project. So for the architect of that project to go and there not to be any, we're clearly not at step 2 of this project. So it seems like we're back to step 1. And that's really frustrating as a fan, as someone who watches this team. I'm sure it's frustrating to be part of the team and feel that way. So some good and some bad, I suppose.
Colin, you have been watching this team from afar. Maybe you haven't had some of the personal interactions that Alex and I have been able to have, but you have had some contact with Jesse, over email and in other ways in the past. I think we talked a lot about the possibility of Almeyda or Jesse or some sort of change was going to be necessary, after the Cali Classico game. So what did you think of the news today? Did they make the right decision here?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting decision in terms of timing and sequence for sure. It's not entirely surprising because, this is a team that has not had particularly good results during the years that Jesse Fioranelli has been here. Didn't make the playoffs in 2017, didn't make them in 2018, and were particularly bad that year. These 3 Almeyda years we've had have been kind of highs and lows, but never excellence in any sense. So it's not surprising to see Jesse Fioranelli lose his job here. I think that the timing and the sequence is interesting because typically when you go and you make a staffing change like this, you're trying to improve the team in some meaningful sense, kind of in the short term. And usually when you're going for short-term changes, you go for the coach because that's what changes the day-to-day, the motivation of the players, the tactical setup that they're in, whatever. Replacing your general manager is as more of a change in long-term direction. So, the results will not improve next weekend or the weekend after that, or, whenever the Quakes are back in PayPal Park, just because Jesse Fioranelli is no longer in the front office. What this is ownership saying, look, we've given this 4+ years, or I guess 4 years-ish now, and it's not working. it's not there. This is not a successful formula for us. And therefore, we'd rather go back to step one and start over and build a different project than continue this one. And so there is no short-term benefit. It's actually quite similar to when the club let go of Dominic Kinnear after he won a game. It was not because they thought that they were going to be better that next weekend without Dominic Kinnear. They didn't even have a serious qualified manager to replace him. They just said, look, where this project is going needs to go in a different direction. And I think that that's a very valid recognition to make at this point. And of course, you have to sort of withhold judgment until you figure out what that new direction is.
Alex, clearly Fioranelli put a lot of eggs into the basket of Matias Almeyda. At the time that he hired Almeyda, he seemed like he was beginning to kind of get on thin ice a bit with the front office. And he had already gone through a number of coaching changes. It felt like Almeyda was a do or die situation for him. Clearly, at the end, I guess you could say it was more of a die. Did he put too many eggs in the Almeyda basket and give him too much freedom in terms of shaping this team? And has that ultimately, been the reason that he was let go today, in your opinion?
I think the answer is yes, Jamon. When you look back at Jesse Fioranelli's tenure in San Jose and you ask, how will it be remembered? Will it be remembered as a successful 4.5 years or an unsuccessful 4.5 years? I think the biggest thing that stands out to me is that there's a sense of, I think, unfulfilled expectations, right? He comes in 4.5 years ago and he talks about how they're going to implement a new data-driven, data-centric approach to running the club, and how they have a long-term vision that's laid out for how this team is going to be successful. And I think it was a great idea, and I think Jesse approached it with earnestness, sincerity, I think kindness and sort of humanness as well. And that's important. He was a very personable general manager. He took the time to speak with us to explain his thinking, his rationality, and that was appreciated. But in the end, the results just weren't there. And the follow through is lacking. Getting from that original idea and implementing it wasn't there. And I think the sense is that the thing that really, was his downfall was that he wasn't able to figure out sort of a relationship or a workflow with Almeyda that really worked, that succeeded. Because it always felt like they were a little bit out of sync, how, Jesse's approach and Jesse's connections in Europe and the players that he was looking to bring in and sign, weren't really Almeyda's, the kind of guys that Almeyda wanted on his roster. And, the guys that Almeyda was trying to bring in and sign, Rios, Fierro, they weren't successful either. So figuring out that relationship in terms of, who is signing these players, who's spearheading the club's recruitment process, it felt like that was out of sync. And ultimately, I think that's the thing that was Fioranelli's downfall and the reason that he was let go this last week.
In case anyone hasn't seen it yet, I did put an article on Quakes Epicenter today. It was pretty much ready to go, just sans the club's quotes that they put into the press release. At the time of it, I did get a notification through a source last night and then confirmed again this morning that Fioranelli had already been let go. To be quite honest, it had happened midday yesterday, and held on to that information at the request of the club. That said, so a lot of my thoughts are in that particular article. One of the questions I posed in there, which I think is unanswered, and it's definitely worth talking about, is Almeyda himself said this past summer that he believes this next summer is the time that a team would be able to come in and be able to scoop him away from the Earthquakes and be able to afford the remaining year of salary that he had left and be able to meet the demands for the club. That's what he said. So why would Fioranelli be selected over Almeyda? I know we touched on this a bit, I think, on Saturday in terms of some of the complexities around Almeyda. But what do you guys think here? Why Fioranelli and not Almeyda in this particular situation? Okay, I'll put it out to anyone.
I'll jump right at this one because I think that the answer is actually quite simple. Almeyda, although we discussed this after that Galaxy game, doesn't necessarily seem to be a very good fit for the Quakes. That doesn't mean that he isn't highly in demand in other places. And you only can retain compensation or you acquire compensation if he goes to another job if you're holding on to his contract. If you let him go, you have to pay out his contract. Sometimes there are terms built into there where if they get other work within a certain time period that can take away from it. But it's basically, if you fire Almeyda, you're eating a lot of money. If you hold on to that contract and another club swoops in for him, then you're entitled to at least some form of compensation. We believe that Almeyda's contract runs through the end of next year, so that contractual control is lesser and the compensation will be lesser. But that's the point at which it will start making more sense for a Monterrey to come in. So I think that is a very simple answer about why Almeyda and not Jesse. I think the other answer is related in some ways to what we've seen before with the Quakes is if you're going to replace a coach, you really ought to have a plan in place for where to go next. They didn't have a plan in place when they fired Dominic Kinnear and they had a non-coach for 6 months and then they had Mikel Stare for a year. They don't want to be that in position again. So I think that although they might not be entirely pleased with Almeyda, I don't think it makes sense in a short-term basis to fire him on that sense either.
Well, I think that puts Almeyda in awkward situation, Colin, because it could be the case where he's sort of a lame duck coach, where Fisher knows that he wants to get rid of him, he wants to get rid of Almeyda, or that Almeyda is going to leave at the end of the year, but he's not willing to push the trigger on that because it's the cheaper option, and he wants to find a cheaper off-ramp for Almeyda, or even a way to get compensated for it. And I don't think that bodes well for this season for the Quakes at all, to have a coach that's sort of already on his way out. And I mean, given everything that Almeyda has said about, his future at the club, his ambitions elsewhere, I can't imagine that he's going to stay beyond this year and certainly not the next. And so then the question becomes, what happens of this season? The Quakes need new reinforcements. They need another reinforcement striker up top in order to get this offense working. But Fisher is certainly, if I were Fisher, I wouldn't let Almeyda make that signing if Almeyda is going to be leaving. But then who is going to make that signing? Because Jesse's role hasn't been replaced. You have Chris Leach, who is staying on as a technical director. But I don't get the sense that he is going to be assuming that responsibility from Jesse in terms of controlling the recruitment process and signing players. So it sort of just, I think, leaves everybody in a position of being stuck for the rest of the year, or in sort of waiting for the other shoe to fall.
Yeah, sure. What do you think about that? Because it is a weird situation. The Quakes have roster spots available, senior roster spots available. We don't really know if Jesse had plans for those spots because his emphasis to us was on the center back signing, which has been made. And now Nathan comes in under this kind of cloud of uncertainty. It seems like probably he's more of a selection by Almeyda and by Bruno Costa. Probably doesn't come offhand like an Almeyda guy, but he is Brazilian. So, what do you make of this whole situation at this point with what Nathan's coming in under and the fact that these roster spots are just sitting there open, and the Quakes definitely have needs that need to be filled?
Yeah, I mean, to speak to the roster spots, they've been open and they haven't been filled for 6 months, a year now. So I think that there were a lot of excuses last year with the pandemic season and people just not being able to get into the U.S. And I think that, we're all receptive to that, but it's been frustrating seeing other teams be able to fill roster slots. And I think that San Jose is like 10 open right now with all the loans they made. And to speak, I just want to get back to Colin's point about Almeyda leaving for another club. It also doesn't have to be a club with Copa America going on, with the Euros going on, and Almeyda's been talked about a national team coach for a long time because of the way he drills his players. Chile plays on Friday, and they've had a bad Copa America, and they are probably going to get crushed by Brazil. After that, I mean, that job could be very well right back open for Almeyda. It might not be something that lasts through the end of the season for San Jose. Frankly, I don't see why it would if this is something that Almeyda is trying to get out of, which I don't have any sources to say that or don't say that, but I think that it's there's always a coaching carousel after these national competitions. I think it's something to be aware of. And that's something where there's also a lot of players kind of make their name in Copa America, make their name in Euros. It's something where it's kind of disappointing another way, because that's somewhere where the Quakes could get someone who seems like an exciting new player, but it seems like they're just going to whiff on this if they don't have a general manager or a plan in place for one of the big, biannual shifts in players and in coaches and all of that.
And one more thing that I want to add, as we're talking about, the plan and what's next for the Quakes, usually when you make a big decision like this, you hire a general manager, you fire a general manager, someone from the club comes out and explains that decision, explains the thought process, the rationale, how they're going to move forward. No one has done that for San Jose. No one has come out and spoken and explained this decision. There was a statement put out which had a brief quote from John Fisher, who was the one who made the decision. This was John Fisher's decision. He is the owner. Jesse reported to him. He made the decision. But it was far short of an explanation, and certainly not talking about what comes next for the Quakes. And that's a problem for me, because on one hand, I think it's a good thing that the Quakes are sort of resetting, they're resetting this long-term vision, short-term vision as well, and looking for a new way forward. But you want that to be done with care, with thought, intentionality, with a plan in place. And sort of the way that they've carried this out isn't indicative that there is one there. The fact that nobody has stepped up to explain it is really concerning to me. And I think in large part that's due to the fact that the club doesn't have a president right now. When Jesse was hired, it was Dave Cavill who came out there, sat down with him, explained why they were bringing in Jesse, where he was going to take the club, and answered all our questions. But for the last year and a half, the Quakes haven't had a president at all. And so right now that responsibility is sort of split among a bunch of C-suite executives, none of whom have a ton of background in sort of running the technical side of a soccer club. And it's up to them to sort of figure out what to do next. And the fact that all of this was done, without a plan to answer those questions and communicate that process, it feels sort of like minor league-ish to me. It doesn't feel well thought out. And so on the one hand, I think, yes, it's a good thing that the Quakes are moving forward in a new direction. But on the other hand, the way that they're going about it is really concerning to me.
Colin, let me pitch this to you real quick, because we talked about roster spots just briefly there, and there are a few comments here. You're our resident roster expert here, so why don't you kind of give us a breakdown in terms of like what the situation is and what the possibilities are for the Quakes at this point?
Yeah, so I just want to briefly do this because obviously, the amount of flexibility that's left in the roster is important for whoever is coming next and for what's going to happen this summer in particular, because we actually are, coming up on a several-month transfer window. I think it was actually adjusted because of COVID, but it will be roughly, I think, into September of this year. So there's kind of a short-term picture and a long-term picture. The short-term picture is it's actually a little bit more locked up than you might want if you were going to do a major rebuild right now today, which is that there are no international slots that are currently available. There are 2 senior slots available and 2 non-senior slots available. That's as it stands today. There's lots of different ways that they can generate a lot more space. Some of those things are kind of, fake roster slots, especially on the junior slots. It's very easy to get those off the roster if you need to go do so. Put Jacob Akinuraj on a loan, for example. And the other thing to note, though, is that in terms of cap space and TAM, they're actually pretty tapped out because of the way that they've structured their deals to get Nathan on a TAM deal, which required a transfer fee, by the way. So I don't know if his salary actually will be above the maximum budget charge of $612,000, but that plus the transfer fee will be. Either way, this summer, not a lot of flexibility unless they make a dramatic move, which would include something like buying out Andy Rios. But short of that, not a lot of flexibility. This coming winter, quite a lot of flexibility. And several of the players have a clear line of sight to a green card later on if they need to. So there's a lot more flexibility built in once they get to the end of the year.
Guys, I want to get to the replacements because the way that I see this, there's really three types, and maybe I'll miss one here and you guys will correct me, but I see three types. One is someone who is more kind of internal with the club, who understands the club, has been a part of the club before. One of the names obviously would be Chris Leach. I think, even talked about him on a show before as a potential stand-in or permanent replacement for Jesse Fioranelli. He's going to pick up some of the duties here in the process. Another name that was put on the patron Slack today, which is an interesting one, and one that's near and dear to you, Colin, I know, and maybe you'll be the one to comment on this, is Dom Kinnear. He's got a history with the club. He hasn't been a GM in MLS, but you could envision a situation where Dom could come back into the club as the general manager as the next phase of his career in MLS. He understands the league well. He understands the roster mechanisms. He's pretty good at identifying talent. We know he's got a knack for being able to handle superstar talent, as he's been able to do in LA and was called out in The Athletic recently. So maybe there's some interesting stuff there. Then there would be to go back to like a Nolan Partners, which is where they got Jesse Fioranelli. And by the way, people might say, hey, don't do the executive search firm thing. But frankly, Nolan Partners is fairly trusted in soccer. I've talked to a couple people kind of outside the Quake sphere about Nolan. They're like, yeah, they're a pretty good executive search firm. They do a decent job in identifying soccer executives. And when the Quakes identified Fioranelli, people were generally pretty excited about his background and felt that the club had done a decent job picking somebody, from the available candidates. And then there would be the MLS retread, let's call it. Somebody who's been out there before, done this, or at least been an assistant GM in another club and is ready to kind of take that next step, could come into the club. One of the names put out there by The Athletic, for instance, Ned Grabavoy at Real Salt Lake, has been identified as a potential future GM, now an assistant at Real Salt Lake, and could be being groomed for something bigger. So that's an example of that. Why don't we try to spread it a bit here? Take your pick one of those three and go with it. Let's start with you, Asher.
I'll take this from Colin. Say I floated Kinnear in the Slack earlier. I thought it was an interesting idea as someone I think it's vital for the GM. They have to know the American soccer sphere. I think it's something that all the successful organizations have someone in that spot who understands the limitations of MLS and understands not just the top of the roster, but how to make the most out of the middle of the roster with homegrowns, with draft picks, things like that. They're usually not the most exciting selections, but I think it's something that has really been lacking in the Fioranelli era, in the Almeyda era. It's been frustrating watching, if we want to be optimistic and say, okay, maybe Almeyda will stay, maybe we'll find something to make him stay. His system relies on people who run hard and try hard. And that's something that America has cheap athletes who do that in droves. And it's been really frustrating seeing that not happen, seeing those players not make it through the system, whether they're from college soccer or Central America. This hasn't been happening here. So someone who knows how to get the most value out of this hemisphere in that middle of the roster, I think is going to be crucial in order for the Quakes to make the next steps they need to make as an organization.
I'll take the internal candidate track here for some of the same reasons that Asher was describing, which is, MLS is such an odd league, given its salary cap at all, let alone the specific mechanisms that are all attached to it. Any country in the world, you'd want to have somebody who'd be able to scout that environment and kind of understand the talent level of the league and what it needs. But given the arcane roster mechanisms, I think it's even more important to have somebody who understands the league. It's not to say that outsiders can't do it. It's just, I think that an outsider would need to get some familiarity with it. That being said, I actually think that a younger person who's kind of earned their stripes on this, back office side is important. I love Dom Kinnear. I think I've made no secret of that over the years. I'm fond of him personally. I was also fond of Jesse Fioranelli personally. He was very generous with his time in the few times that we did have conversations. But I think that you need somebody who, I think that the role of a sports executive in all sports, but particularly soccer, has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 20 years. Soccer has been one of the later ones to kind of come to the analytics revolution and to treating soccer as more of a business, to be made rational decisions and kind of have that, empiricist approach, where previously that was not the norm. I think Dominic Kinnear is not necessarily that guy. I think Chris Leach could be that guy. I think Chris Leach is a very bright, I think he's a bright young person who does understand the league and the club specifically. When I was covering the club deeply, he was the academy director, and he was good at just relating to those kids even. So it's not like he's someone who's sitting behind a desk and who never played the game himself. He played it, he can relate to people, and I think he's been grooming himself for this role. I think that's the safest choice to go for next.
Alex.
I agree with Colin in that I think Chris Leach is sort of the natural replacement. He's been in the organization for a long time. As academy director, he was interim coach for a while. He sort of served as Jesse's understudy in this role of technical director for a couple of years. So he sort of knows how this organization operates from every facet of the technical side. So I think he's the natural next person up, but I don't know if that's the direction that the Quakes will go, because this decision, as I said earlier, it's in the hands of the C-suite executives, in the Earthquakes. And I don't know. The question is, I guess, if they trust their soccer judgment enough. If they're willing to step up and make that call themselves to keep it in-house and keep it with Chris Leach, or to delegate it to a firm like Nolan Partners that sort of has a more proven track record, right? I've heard mixed reviews about, consultancy firms like that. Paul Tenorio of The Athletic pulled out a stat earlier today about how the current coaches and general managers in MLS that were sort of hired through this consultancy process have quite low, points per game and are significantly less successful than other general managers in MLS right now. So I think Chris Leach is the next man up, but in the end, I think there's a lot of sort of internal politics involved in that decision-making process that make me doubtful or make me question whether that's what they'll end up doing.
Can I just throw one name out there before we go to Q&A?
Go ahead.
Campbell, California's own and San Jose Earthquakes former player, Paul Bravo, who is a local. He did coach the Oakland Roots briefly last year or 2 years ago, I suppose. I don't think he's much of a coach. He was the technical director for the Colorado Rapids during the brief period that they were good, and he's a local guy. Just somebody to think about.
Interesting. So we could add into the potential internal type candidates. I just get the feeling that, at least with the people that we interact with on Twitter, and I know that's not all the audience here, but if the Quakes go in a different direction, again, kind of that third direction that no one's really expecting, and it doesn't work out, I just feel like the fans are going to be back to pining for someone like a Chris Leach or a Dom Kinnear or even maybe a Paul Bravo, Colin. And, until like Ian Russell's the head coach, like these names are just going to keep coming up until someone like finally just does it. I kind of wonder if like we really just kind of like need to see it. And so we can satisfy somewhat the curiosity of what would a Leach and Russell combination be at GM and coach, once the coaching vacancy opens up as well. And I feel like just at some level, like we just need to know, is that potentially the future that would be the best future for the San Jose Earthquakes? And I feel like delaying that, if it doesn't work well, is just going to create a lot more noise on the next go round. Let's go to the Q&A. And
Can I jump on something real quick before Q&A?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm actually going to go
back
back and read the questions while you do that.
It is astonishing to put all your chips in the CONCACAF Coach of the Year bucket of Almeyda, and then 3 years later be like, oh, what about Chris Leach? What if we go back to what we can do internally? It's really telling that even when this franchise shoots for the moon and gets the moon, they still they just don't know what to do when they get there. And it seems like that's been whose fault that was is something that is a much bigger conversation than tonight. But it's incredible to be thinking of the guy who was coaching in 2017 as the GM after landing the CONCACAF Coach of the Year, in my opinion.
Okay, so what we're going to do here is we asked our patrons who are on our patron Slack channel, and again, just to kind of, if you don't know what the Patreon is about, you can go to quakesepicenter.com/Patreon. You can get in for as little as $2 into the Patreon and get access to the article that I published earlier today. Just in the last 3 weeks, the team here has published 6 articles, so we are putting out a lot of content, and sometimes when the team is actually performing worse, we have more inspiration to draw from to write, and so you actually might get even more articles in the short term because of that. But for $5, you get access to our patron Slack. We also have a $15 level if you're feeling particularly generous with an additional benefit or two tied to that. These comments, these questions, we promised to our patrons today that they could have first shot at it. So I'm going to go to the patron Slack and just take it one by one. Somebody just jump in and take one, and we'll just kind of rotate it here. Let's just do one person per question for time. So the first question comes from Matt Richardson. How much trust does Leach have? He's been at the Quakes a long time, but would Fisher trust him with a significant investment to keep the promise of competitiveness to Wando? Do you think at this time that Leach has the ability to be able to be the GM and get a more significant investment than Fioranelli was able to because he's got a longer standing relationship with Fisher, or does that not really matter when it comes to Fisher? Who wants to take it?
I think that this is an organization that doesn't do things rashly. They like going in-house because they like stability. And I think that their belief in, sorry, I might just fill down here. I think the Oakland A's are a good model to look for how they manage this organization, meaning, this is an organization that is going to prioritize stability, giving people a shot, having a clear direction, because they think that that yields better results than shifting course the minute it's not going well. To that, it's a positive. But on the other hand, the fact that Leach was overlooked in the last GM search, the fact that they're going to cost an open search here, I think they perhaps recognize that they are able to go out and get a more elite talent somewhere out in the world if their aperture is big enough. So I do think that they have slightly higher aspirations. And
we know that Chris Leach is being considered. That was something that our colleague Jeff Carlisle from ESPN reported by his sourcing earlier today, that Chris Leach is being considered for the role. But on the other hand, they didn't name him interim general manager. It feels like if the idea was that he would step up, or that you end up going with him, that you would name him interim general manager, but he's keeping his title right now as technical director. And we have no word about whether he's assuming any of the responsibilities of general manager at all. So it feels like that would have been a way to show trust in his capacity to do the job.
Yeah, let me take that real quick, because actually one of my sources had said that he was going to basically be stepping into the interim role. I got a clarification from the club today before the press release came out that was not the case. He was not being given the interim label. And just as a point of note, before Jesse Fioranelli was named the general manager, Leach was the interim general manager and was given the role of interim general manager. So that is something that's a little bit interesting there. Let me go to the next question. I'm going to take this one for rather obvious reasons after I read it here. So this one comes from Matt Weike. Assuming Almeyda is let go after this season, if Ian Russell were offered the head coach gig, would he even take it? Or is it more important for the new GM to be part of the coaching search? I've had conversations with Ian Russell before. Obviously this was before he took the Toronto job, but he certainly has told me before that he would love the opportunity in the future to be the coach of the San Jose Earthquakes. He didn't feel that now was the right time. When there was rumors about Almeyda leaving in the offseason, he said, look, I need to get back into MLS. Toronto is going to be the way for me to do it for right now. But at some point, Would I love to be the coach of the San Jose Earthquakes? Absolutely. So in no uncertain terms, we know that he would love to do that. He would love to get his first MLS head coaching gig. And if it's with the Earthquakes, I think he's all for that. He still has a great love for the Earthquakes and for the organization and would do that. That said, the general manager has to get his guy. And so if that general manager is not Chris Leach, or it's not one of the other local candidates, or Adam Kinnear, or even a Paul Bravo, the chance that someone's going to come from the outside and select Ian Russell as the head coach, to me, feels extremely remote. And so that's definitely going to be something to watch. Based upon the type of candidate, I think it's going to give you a good sense as to who, or at least, a locale that likely that next head coach, after Almeyda is going to come from, whether it's, at the end of this season or at the end of Almeida's full 4-year contract.
Because I think, Jimmy, you saw what happened with Dom Kinnear and Jesse Fioranelli when you don't let the general manager, decide who their coach is going to be immediately, right? It felt like the Quakes wasted 6 months or so, in that first season where Jesse Fioranelli kept Dom Kinnear for the first half of his first year in San Jose. The Quakes are actually doing quite well. Then decides to fire him midway through the year. The team starts to sort of fall apart. And I think created a mess of that situation, created tension with the players, with the fans. So the way that was handled, I think was poor. And that's why I think you just need to give a new general manager a clean slate in terms of coaching. And I think that, really serious candidates, elite general managers, soccer executives from around the world, I think that will be something they demand when they come to San Jose. I don't think that you can get a top general manager, a top hire, if you have all of these contingencies. If you say, well, you need to do it with this coach and with this strategy, and we're going to sort of pigeonhole you into this role, that's not going to fly with, I think, the best candidates. I think the best candidates will demand that they get sort of that room to make their own decisions and set their own philosophy.
Okay, a lot of questions here. Let's keep it moving. I'm going to just shorten this one up a little bit. The next one is talking about Jesse's firing. What does it have to do with Almeyda's relationship with the front office? It seemed like Jesse and Almeyda saw eye to eye on most issues, and he was responsible. So how does this affect Almeyda's relation with the rest of the front office?
Well, so very briefly, we know that although their approaches didn't necessarily ever mesh into something successful, Jesse did very much hitch his wagon to Almeyda, and therefore they were very much a package in many ways. They understood that their fates were linked to each other. And I think that, based on what the four of us have heard from the front office, they kind of saw it the same way. And I think it's fair to say that the front office is not enthralled with Matias Almeyda. They're not singing at his hymnal necessarily. It doesn't mean that they're going to kick him to the curb. It just means that they are not committed to him in like a deep way. They were very ready to fire him last fall if that bad run had continued at all. And I think that they'd be very happy to see him go relatively soon. I think this is the first part of a reorientation of the franchise, and it is purely for financial and practical reasons that Almeyda is not gone as well.
I think there is a little wrinkle in the timing in that it was only a week ago that the Quakes signed Nathan, who is a new TAM level player on a 3-year contract. That's a pretty significant contract. And so that makes me wonder sort of how much of this was premeditated and why Fisher would approve that signing if he knew that, he was going to be letting go of Jesse Fioranelli the next week. And it makes me also wonder, where Matias Almeyda was in that signing process, because it feels a lot like a Jesse Fioranelli signing as opposed to a Matias Almeyda signing. And when we asked, Almeyda about the signing after the Galaxy match, he didn't seem incredibly thrilled about it. He sort of said, yes, having more depth, having more players on the bench is always good. That's not, necessarily what you would expect after you sign a high-level player like this. I think I would have expected a response, like, this is the guy that is going to fix our defense. This is the guy that's going to help our defense go to the next level. If that was truly something that Almeyda was thrilled about. So where Nathan gets caught up in all of this is sort of interesting to me, Jamon.
Sorry, trying to get that off mute there. So we got a couple questions from Ryan. Ryan, I think we answered your first question. I'm going to go to your second here. With so many roster spots open and so many players in the last year of deals, does that make the general manager job in San Jose more appealing because of the roster flexibility coming up in the offseason to really kind of build your own team? I think someone calculated in the range of $4 million of potential contracts would be ending if the options were declined and such. That does seem to be a good bit of flexibility, although we saw in this last offseason, the Quakes didn't sign and use all the money that they had paid previously in salaries and had, let's say Danny Houston and Vaco and Nick Lima and such, and replace that with the same money. They actually didn't spend all that money again. So just because contracts are being let go doesn't mean they're going to spend everything that becomes available. But, if you're trying to dangle a carrot out there for a general manager, that seems kind of appealing, wouldn't you think, Asher?
It sounds appealing in theory. I like the idea. There's a lot of people coming off the books, as you said. It'll be really interesting to see what happens this transfer window with the Almeyda's guys, so to speak. If Theo gets back healthy and ends up going elsewhere, where Alanis, if he goes back to Mexico, it'll be interesting to see. I think that'll really tell us a lot as well about the continuity here, with or without Almeyda. That said, I don't think that Fioranelli or Almeyda came into the season wanting to have 3 center midfielders on the roster. I don't think they wanted to come in with, Kikanovic as the third striker. If I was interviewing for the position, I would wonder if I'd be able to get 30 men on my 30-man roster, because that just hasn't been the case. And I don't know where the disconnect is. Of the 4 of us, I'm the one without sources. But that is it's extremely concerning to not replace the people they have lost, not just in terms of money, but just in terms of minutes and actual humans with heartbeats on the roster.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Asher. So another question from Ryan here. Ryan, I'm going to cut you off after this, but thank you for putting so many questions in. After hiring, because I think this is a really good one, after hiring the most expensive coach staff in the league and then not signing DPs, is there a lesson to be learned here? Should the Quakes invest less on the coach going forward and more on the players instead? If you're asking Fisher to spend the same amount of money, how would you spend it differently on the next go around? Colin, let's go to you.
The short answer is absolutely. The folly here is the analogy would be you're hiring an F1 driver and to drive a Corolla or something, right? You're spending quite a lot of money on one element, but quite frankly, coaching doesn't necessarily. I forget actually. This might have been Claudio Ranieri who said that a good coach will make a team about 10% better than it is, and a bad coach will make it about 30% worse. If you just have somebody kind of holding the fort and doing very little, you're actually going to get most of what the roster is capable of. A good coach will absolutely put it one notch above, but spending a huge amount of money on a coaching staff on long contracts, who, by the way, also demanded huge control over the roster and the entire technical part of the organization. And that's something that shouldn't be lost here is Jesse Fioranelli was not the only person involved in making soccer decisions once Almeyda came on. He ceded quite a bit of control to Almeyda, and that's just a basic condition of getting a top manager. I think the Quakes had things backwards. I think that you need the top decision maker to be someone you absolutely trust to get the roster right, and then put the right coach in place to get them to where you want to go. I think that putting the right coach in place with a crap roster and giving that coach tons of control, even when he hasn't proven himself a good talent identifier, that's a recipe for disaster. So yes, I don't think that you go for a massively expensive coach again until you have your house in order.
Alex, I'll put it out to you. Last question from the Slack from Robert. What, if any, role will Chris Wondolowski have with the organization after his playing days are over? Will potential churn, not just in the general manager role, but other potential roles in the organization at the end of the season, create opportunity for the Quakes to find a spot for Wando, or do you think he moves on?
I think that Chris Wondolowski will have a role in this organization for many years to come. I think he's expressed interest in staying in soccer after his playing career is over, potentially being an academy coach. Maybe you could see him in the role of a scout or some other tangential role in the organization. I don't think he desires or is the right man to put in any role of serious responsibility in terms of running the technical side of the club. But I think that, whoever the next general manager is, will probably see Chris Wondolowski as sort of a good ambassador for the club, and having him around is sort of good for the continuity of the club and, a way to stay connected with the fans. So I think that he still has a valuable role to play in this organization after his playing years are over. Based on what he said in the past, how many times he's considered retirement before, sort of the way this season's going, the way he's been playing this season, I'd be surprised if he continued playing next year. I think this will probably be his last year playing in Major League Soccer. So I see sort of a natural transition for him into sort of a different role in the front office.
I want to thank everyone again for joining us tonight. Doing something like this impromptu, you never know if you're going to get 5 people show up or 50 people show up. But great crowd. Thank you so much. The comments have been fantastic. Most of them have been very constructive, which we appreciate. There are a couple good questions in here, and I want to recognize that people have been, in there asking questions. I want to try to take a couple of them that haven't been asked yet. One of the things that was a bit interesting, a comment that one of my sources made today, is that it does feel like Matias Almeyda has been trying to build a relationship with John Fisher. Now, the other one kind of poo-pooed that and said, well, this was mostly a financial transaction. They picked Jesse because he was the cheaper guy, and Almeyda's got 1.5 years left on his contract. So let's set that aside for the second. Let's say that Almeyda has been creating a relationship with John Fisher, that John Fisher thinks that Matias Almeyda is a really smart guy and can help this organization grow. Eliezer Hernandez, about 5 minutes ago, Alex, if you're able to pull up his comments, says, I'm not sure if you guys spoke about this yet, but would there be a chance that Almeyda wants full control? I believe he wanted that when he was in Chivas. What do you think, guys? Is there a possibility we see Matias grow into more of a Peter Vermees type character here and actually be in the Earthquakes longer in the organization, assume some general manager type responsibilities, and perhaps have one of his assistants turn into a day-to-day coach? Is it possible he's pitching Fisher about this and maybe he'll get a cameo for it the rest of the season? What do you guys think?
I would be surprised, only because of the sort of confrontational comments he has made towards John Fisher. Behind the scenes, he's been building a relationship with Fisher. We know he's had multiple conversations with Fisher over the last 6 months, 7 months, which is sort of unusual, I think, for a head coach in Major League Soccer to go directly to the owner. But towards us in the press, he's just made so many comments about, sort of having a lack of support from ownership not having enough ambition in terms of how much money they're investing, the signings they're making, sort of shifting so much of the blame onto ownership publicly. I would be very surprised then if Fisher turns around and gives Jesse, more investment, more buy-in, and more control. That would be a sort of surprising twist of events to me.
It's very simple. Matias absolutely wants full control of the team. He already has about 80% control of the team, and it would be insane to give it to him given his track record. Peter Vermees has an established track record of this. Matias doesn't, but he's an immensely charming man, so never count him out.
I'd say it's unlikely, but would be incredibly entertaining if it did happen. So consider that the other option is if they have a very less than entertaining next 6 months. Sure, it should happen. Be fun to watch.
We've always been saying that the Earthquakes with Almeyda are entertaining. Is everyone entertained right now? That's certainly a question for today. Okay, so I would like to take one more here. ST Audio asks a question for the 4 show hosts. If Fisher called you and asked who I should hire as GM, what would your answer be? And I think we've probably already said this through other kind of comments, but if he asked you if I should keep Matias as coach, what would you say? So let's just go around and go like, would you like to see be the next general manager of the San Jose Earthquakes? Alex, go.
Quite frankly, I would say that I'm not the right man to make that call, and certainly not in this moment, Jamon. I think whatever they need to do needs to be well thought out. They need to have a plan in place, and they need to sort of go about it, methodically, in a sort of sequence that makes sense. And I think that, Fisher needs to sort of be the person to step up and, set that direction from the club. I think a lot of the issues that they've had about sort of a vacuum in the front office, not having a club president, not having a direction, that all goes back to Fisher in the end. And, the moves that he's making behind the scenes. And so I think before they even, start on this process, embark on this process of hiring the GM, they need to figure out all that stuff, that, sort of chain of command, and, the approach they're going to take to running this organization behind the scenes. And I think they need to figure that out before you pick a candidate to become the general manager. Because if you don't, you're sort of throwing them into this sort of chaotic pot in there and hoping it works. I think from the top down, they need to have a sort of well thought out approach to this.
Does that mean that they need to rehire Tom Fox's position?
I thought you were going to say rehire Tom Fox. They do not need to rehire Tom Fox. Tom Fox,
the president. Do they need a president?
Yeah, I think they need a president. I think they need a spokesperson from this club. And look, maybe you just promote somebody from within the club. Maybe that's Jared Shawley. In some extent, he's already sort of assumed that role. Maybe it's Ian Anderson, who is the vice president of strategy. He has a close connection with John Fisher as well. But I think they need somebody to sort of set the tone, at the top of the organization.
Colin, Asher, either of you?
Quick for me, it's Leach on GM. I think he's the best person to stabilize the ship right now and the best person to build around. And I would, in terms of Matias's future, I'd be on the phone with Chile's Soccer Federation yesterday even, discussing compensation. The only other thing I'd bring up is my favorite concept in the world is penny wise and pound foolish, which is when you're trying to save money today, but you're ultimately costing yourself a lot of money in the long run. I think that the Quakes have been penny wise and pound foolish with their back office staffing below the general manager position. So I'm talking about the scouting department, or the lack thereof. It's really just Bruno Costa. I'm talking about the fact that they don't have any full-time data analysts. They don't have the backroom staff. They don't have the physical infrastructure and all of those elements that a lot of other MLS clubs do. So what I would do is I'd take Chris Leach, not the most proven entity. You might be able to get a shinier object elsewhere, but I would back him. I would back him with infrastructure, not just the playing staff salary.
And he's booing your response there, Alex, just to point that out. It's a fun question. It's the purple sweater question, Alex, and you decided to make it non-fun. Asher, final comments for you from the set of questions tonight.
Yeah, Alex and Colin are both correct. But to answer the question, to have some more fun with it, Ned Grabavoy is a good shout. Kerry Zavagnin, someone from Vermees's staff in Sporting KC. Yeah, he'd be a good coach. But they're both right. I would leave it with that.
Yeah, I just kind of go back to this whole thing. If you don't try like the Leach-Russell combination or even the Kinnear-Russell combination or something, I just think people are going to just continue to pine for these things until it actually happens. And if it never happens, then, we're just going to be, Earthquakes fans who are going to say the same things forever until they never happen. So, okay, so let's just do this. Final comments going around the horn. Asher, I'll just kind of come back with you and kind of start there. Anything final that you want to leave people with tonight, or any comment that you want to call out and respond to?
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. But I think it's, last season ended for Chris Wondolowski with him sitting in empty Van Earthquake Stadium after a really hard-fought season, and then with him hitting an incredible equalizer against Sporting KC in the playoffs. And it seemed like he was really ready to hang it up, and he really got convinced by Almeyda, by Jesse Fioranelli, by Fisher to come back for one more season. And before the season, he was talking about how much he believed in this project, how much he believed in what Fioranelli and Almeyda were building here. And for the rug to be pulled out of pulled out from under the most important person in San Jose Earthquakes history is really astonishing in a lot of ways. I can see how it could be called for. I understand, it's not shocking for any of us, I don't think, but the way the organization convinced him to come back and then treated his final season this way is just a colossal bummer in any way you look at it. And that's really unfortunate for someone who's given so much to the organization, to the Bay Area, to U.S. soccer, to be finishing a season under a lame duck. Everything is just a colossal bummer.
Alex, I'll shoot it over to you. Any final comment or question you wanted to address?
I think my reaction here is just surprise in sort of the manner in which this has been carried out, in sort of the haphazard way that they've approached this decision. Jesse and Almeyda have gone through a lot of rough periods before, where they easily could have been fired. In the September of last year was probably the main point. The question is, why now? Why right at this moment, in the middle of the season, are you letting go of Fioranelli? It feels like Fisher is trying to send a message by doing that. But it's unclear what the message is because nobody's there to communicate it. And that sort of absence, for me, is disappointing. Leaves a lot more questions than answers at this point for the Earthquakes and what's next for them.
Colin will give you the final word.
Penny wise and pound foolish. That's the thought I want to leave you all with, that I want you to ruminate on. You build a house from the ground up. And I think we all know that Jeff Fisher or John Fisher should probably be spending a little bit more on this club. It's actually not, he doesn't need to double his spending. 20% more would probably close a lot of these gaps, a lot of which I would allocate towards these back office and these kind of invisible things. But the thing you got to keep in mind is he's not increasing his spending in part because he hasn't necessarily trusted the people who are executing the spending in recent years. So that's what I mean by penny wise, pound foolish. You got to get those core things right. Get a GM that you trust, back that GM with the right infrastructure behind him or her, for that matter. We've seen some female sports executives in the last couple of years. Put the infrastructure in place for them to create a new project, and then turn this, open the spigot and let them go. But this thing comes first. So it's going to be a long transition, but I would strip it to the studs and start over.
Jeff Fisher, former NFL head coach. I have done that many times, Colin. Jeff Fisher instead of John Fisher. I have to do that in my head way too often. Guys, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for taking the time, particularly from the East Coast, Colin, and now I believe from Central Time Zone, Asher. Good to have you both on tonight with Alex and I. Alex, as always, thank you for joining us. Hopefully, fans, we got to answer your questions tonight, but if not, leave us a comment on the show, and we will do our best to try to get to as many of them as we can. This for Jamon Moore, Alex Morgan, Colin Etnire, Asher Kohn, and our entire crew at Quakes Epicenter. Have a good evening. Thanks for joining us.